Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. So today we have Suramya TK with us to discuss a very interesting and timely topic, Chicago to India workers' rights and resistance. So Suramya is a PhD scholar. She specializes in the areas of labor and legal history. Her PhD thesis titled Regulation and Resistance in the Beedi Industry of Malabar 1930 to 1970 has been submitted at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. And the thesis is centered around the questions of capital labor relations and the role of state in the decentralization of production and informalization of employment in India, and with particular focus on the legalities in labor relations. And she's an economist by training from Hyderabad Central University, and her present research includes modern Indian history, Kerala history, and history of capitalism. She is also the recipient of the Charles Wallace Fellowship, and also she was a former employee at policy research, like she was a policy researcher at the Center for Good Governance, an institute under Telangana government. Thank you so much for joining, Suramya, uh, and accepting our invitation at a short notice. So the stage is all yours. You can share the screen now.
Yeah. Is it audible?
Yeah, yes. And we can see the
You
slides
can
also.
see the
Yes,
screen, right?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
So first of all, thank you, Kranti. And I'm really glad that you're conducting these kind of a series of talks regarding the workers' issues and other important issues in the country, and as well as for the global issues. So I will begin my discussion with the importance of May Day for India and also in the world. So today we are here to discuss the relevance of May Day in the working class history with a special reference to India. I have immense pleasure to initiate this discussion on this topic as it is taking place at an important historical juncture where there is a threat to the working class rights, the rights achieved through historical struggles and sacrifices. Briefly, I would like to discuss the origin and significance of International Labour Day. We may remember the May Day as a holiday all over the world, but there is more meaning to it. So we all are happy that we can get a holiday on May 1st, but we also need to think that it's not only a concept of a holiday; it also is above that. It is a day to commemorate the battle of the workers and their hard work to sustain the humanity. May Day is observed all over the world to create an awareness among the workers about their legal rights. So now we can get into the history of May Day. It's associated with the Haymarket incident in Chicago in 1886. That is a strike which resulted in the death of 8 people and the conviction of 8 hours. So basically, the strike was solidarity with the 8 hours of working day movement, which was initiated in the Chicago. So the Second International, a movement initiated in Paris in 1889 to form an international association of socialists, decided to observe May 1st as a day to demand 8 hours of work as a legal right of the workers all over the world. Since then, the May Day celebrations all over the world witnessed parades and rallies. The observation of May Day is often linked to Marx's call for the unification of the working class worldwide. His slogan, Workers of the World Unite, became an important expression of unity for the working class. In India, May Day was first celebrated in 1923, and this was also the first time a red flag was hoisted in the country in relation to the working class struggle. The celebration was organized by the Labour Kisan Party under the leadership of Singara Velar, and a resolution was passed in the meeting to declare May 1st as a holiday in the country. So now we have three important questions in hand. What is the major point of resistance for the working class? How is it relevant to achieve their rights as workers? Whether the working class resistance is for the determination of a decent wages and reasonable working hours. These questions are very much important in this discussion on the relevance of May Day. A short discussion on the capitalist production and fixation of work time and wages will throw some light on the rights of the working class for which workers are on the streets. So the history of capitalist production is also the history of dialectics between capital and labor on the fixation of hours of work and the wages. This bargaining on time and money between the workers and the capitalists manifests into the essential contradiction of the capitalist relations of production. But this dialectic cannot be understood merely as a direct struggle between capital and labor, because the conflict of interest within the capitalist class and the interest of state as a third party makes the struggle complex and multidimensional. An investigation into this primary contradiction between capital and labor will thus require an understanding of conflicts at the periphery and therefore needs deeper analysis to address the crucial question, what determines the wages and length of the working day. So once again, I'm telling the crucial question here is what determines the wages and length of the working day. Production can only take place when the worker agrees to sell and the capitalist agrees to buy labor power or labor time at a mutually agreed wage. The workers who become part of the production process can be seen only as personified labor time by merging all individual distinctions. But the fixation of the working hours for a particular wage becomes tricky when there is no natural or moral principle which limits the length of the working day. Similarly, the capitalist objective of maximization of profit through ruthless exploitation directly contradicts the workers' need for shorter working days. According to Marx, the worker, by virtue of being a human, requires time to satisfy his intellectual and social wants. Consequently, there is a natural limit to the quantity of vital force that a human can expend. Therefore, the maximum number of hours of work is limited by both these physical and moral constraints. Extending the working day without taking these factors into consideration is counterproductive and leads to an increase in the production time and often shortens the actual lifetime of the worker. Thus, there arises the requirement for an effective mechanism which can minimize, if not resolve, these conflicts of interest and thereby determine the duration of a working day. So here I emphasized on the question of the length of the working day and also the wages. So how it is determined. So once we get into this topic, we need to see how it is relevant to India or the context of India. The intervention in capital labor relation through legislation was the method adopted by the state to resolve this issue. India was no exception to this rule, and the colonial period did witness the legal interventions of the state in capital labor relations after an early non-interventionist phase. The fixation of maximum hours of work through legislation such as the Factories Act can be understood as an attempt from the part of the colonial state in taking part in this process of the determination of working hours as an external force. It is also important to note that at each period in time, according to the bargaining power of capital and labor, the duration of the working day varied across the various administrative regions within the country. So here my emphasis is on the legislations and how it is important to mediate the capital labor conflicts and smoothen the production process. The early period of industrialization in India did not immediately witness any discussion of state policy or legislation concerning labor rights or conditions of work. The long hours of labor under strenuous working conditions had severe impacts on the health and well-being of the laboring poor. The industrialists were least concerned and were not legally liable for the welfare of the workers during this period. The early legal interventions of the colonial state in India till 1881 was to aid the capitalists and were not to ensure the rights of the workers. So basically, during this period, there is a concept of criminalization of labor. So till 1881, there are those attempts by the part of the state to aid the capitalists by legislating laws such as the Bonded Labor Act and also the criminalization of Labor Act and also implementing it in the plantations. So all these attempts were to aid the capitalists instead of aiding the workers. The early legal interventions of the colonial state in India till 1881 was to aid the capitalists and were not to ensure the rights of the workers. More importantly, these early labor laws were the means to reconstruct the traditional worker and to constitute a modern and efficient labor subject to fit into the new industrial vision then taking shape. The British established the first cotton mill in Bengal as early as in 1818, but only 4 decades later did the development of large-scale factories occurred as a phenomenon in colonial India. The beginning of this modern industrialization was inaugurated with the setting up of a cotton textile mill in Bombay in 1851 and a jute mill in Bengal in 1855. Subsequent years witnessed the increasing number of workers attracted to these modern industries. With the removal of the import duty on the heavy machineries in 1860, large-scale industries began to develop chiefly with British capital. Even then, till the 20th century, the number of factory workers remained insignificant. Compared to workers in other sectors of the economy, employment of women and children among the adult male workers, long hours of hard work inside factories or workshops, dangerous work conditions, low wage rates, poor health and hygiene conditions, etc. became the features of these modern industries. The conditions in Indian textile industrial sector was a reason for unrest, not among the impoverished textile workers in India, but among the British textile capitalists in Lancashire and Manchester. They were terribly unhappy about the kind of advantage that Indian capital had by virtue of the free and unlimited opportunity to exploit workers and hence procure cheap labor. Their specific demand to the British administration in India was to cut down the working hours of the Indian factory labor by enacting and enforcing the Factories Act in India and thereby removing the unfair advantage that the Indian capital had over British capital. As a response to this lobbying, the colonial government in India appointed several labor inquiry commissions. The commissions found out that the Bombay textile mills were working on a general agreement that a working day was of 12 hours or more and continued operating without a weekly holiday. Capitulating to the British big capital, the colonial government, however, decided to enact the Factories Act in India. With the passing of the first Factories Act of 1881, the focus of labor laws for the first time shifted towards the improvement of working conditions and identified workers as a political category to be considered for legislation. We can see that, ironically, it was not the result of any working class movement, but the direct outcome of British capital interests winning the economic tug of war against their competitors in India. It is also historically important as it marked the first attempt of the Indian state to regulate industrial policy for the welfare of the workers. Although the first Factories Act only focused on child labor, the subsequent Factories Acts addressed issues of women, men, and the duration of their working hours became a matter of concern. We can also see that the Indian Factories Act, which was implemented in India, was in the line of the Factories Act, which was already existed in Britain. So it had similarities. So the argument of the British capital was that the legislations which was implemented in Britain needs to be implemented in India to have a fair play when it comes to the production. Apart from these international pressures and commercial interests of the British capital, in the last part of the 19th century, there were isolated attempts of Indian workers for reforms. A petition demanding shorter work days, holidays, meal breaks, and injury compensation was signed by over 5,000 Bombay mill operatives and presented by N.M. Long Dande to the Commission on Indian Factories in 1889. There was a growing dissatisfaction among the industrial workers about the abysmal conditions of work. In 1890, an effort made by two philanthropists from Bombay resulted in the founding of the Bombay Mill Hands Association. This is the first workers' organization in India. Although this association was quite different from the modern trade unions, it was an active agent in bargaining for the amendment of the Factories Act in 1891. The 1890, in the 1890, N.M. Lokdande organized workers in Bombay and they demanded a compulsory closing of mills for one day in the week. The buildup of the organized working class resistance resulted in the country witnessing many significant workers' strikes in the early years of the 20th century. So the 20th century is very important in the rising of workers and their struggles, especially with respect to the determination of working hours and increase in wages. Textile mill workers and railway workers were the pioneers of these working class struggles. From 1850 to 1900, the size of the industrial working class in India was insignificant, and laborers largely resorted to traditional methods of resistance, such as a reaction towards the exploitative labor practices. They mostly protested by breaching the contracts or looting rather than resorting to organized strikes or industrial violence. Organized protests for higher wages, shorter hours of work, adequate compensation for injuries, or life and better working conditions were not very common. But the advent of the 20th century marked an increase in the number of the industrial workers in the country, along with an improvement in the collective consciousness of the workers. So by 1920s, these unrest of the workers became a major concern for the capitalists, also for the state. This can be seen mainly from the increased working class struggles, working class strikes and petitions filed to the state. And particularly in the aftermath of the First World War, the discontent of the workers increased. During this period, long working hours and wage cuts became the major reasons for workers' unrest. This was the beginning of the organized militant working class struggles in the country. Before the implementation of Trade Union Act of 1920, the government saw itself as the guardian of law and order and the industrial workers as the source of violent conflict. But now, many a time, the government had to mediate the disputes between the trade unions and the industrialists. It had to shift its role from a dominant authority which enforces laws to a mediator in the industrial disputes. Even though on paper there occurred a role shift, in practice the nature of government remained unaltered. Thus, despite professions of neutrality between capital and labor, the government repeatedly used state power to support the employers and to thwart effective strike action. One of the important historical periods of the Indian working class movement was the interwar period from 1914 to 1939. This period witnessed the development of trade union movement and the enactment of many landmark labor legislations within the country. The enforcement of legislations became a serious concern for the workers as well as the state. Another point to note here is that from the period 1918 to 1939, the number of factories and workers increased. These changes in the size of the industrial working class and their political awakening led to the formation of organized trade union movement in India. The first trade union of the workers in the country was the Madras Labor Union, formed in 1918. The formation of All India Trade Union Congress in 1920, the first national trade union, was the another turning point in the working class struggle. So these turning points in the trade union history of India, we can see that the important factors behind them are the First World War, and this led to the worsening of the working conditions, and this created a kind of discontent among the workers. And also the Indian workforce was got inspired from the Russian Revolution, and also the worsened work condition during the Great Depression was also a factor, and the Second World War and its after effects also led to the discontent among the working class. A short history of All India Trade Union Congress. Prem Sagar Gupta writes, the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the deepening economic crisis had unleashed a revolutionary wave over the world, and India could not remain immune to its influence and impact. Working class in India had a new awakening, and this development kindled the spirit of the masses of the working people to rise against their age-long oppression and exploitation. Now, the background of colonial labor legislations need to be further analyzed in the context of cross-border solidarity. In the early period, the British reforms largely reflected the aspirations and interest of the capitalist class in Britain. There was also a small but significant contribution of the British trade unions, who pressurized for reforms in Indian labor management. This can be understood from the very fact that the important decisions which directly affected the life of Indian workers were made in Britain. So I have already mentioned about the kind of pressure which was exerted by the British capital over the Indian administration to enact a legislation, that is basically the Factories Act of 1891, to avoid the cheap labor availability in the Indian industrial sector, to compete with the Indian capital. As the interest of the workers in India and Britain were similar in many circumstances, British workers extended their support and solidarity to the demands of Indian working class. This resulted in the colonial regime resorting to measures aimed at thwarting the solidarity of the working class across borders. The international uniformity in the labor regulations was also a major factor which forced the colonial government to undertake labor reforms and welfare measures in the colonies. For example, following the conclusions of the International Labour Conference held among European states in Berlin in 1890, the British government pressed the Governor General to adopt higher minimum ages of employment in Indian industry, even though the Britain had refused to raise its own minimum to meet the Berlin standards. The formation of the International Labour Organization in 1919 and the participation of Britain in this forum resulted in the promotion of international harmonization of labor law as well as dialogue between workers' groups, at least in theory, by the colonial regime. Britain faced immense pressure from the international community to reform the labor laws and to bring them into conformity with ILO Convention, both at home and in the colonies. Partly because of the pressure from the British trade unions, and partly due to the struggle put up by the Indian workers, the Trade Union Act of 1926 materialized, which serves as a classic example of cross-border solidarity. The year 1926 also marked the repeal of the notorious Workmen's Breach of Contract Act that was implemented in 1854. Similarly, the successive labor welfare amendments in the Indian Factories Act were also partly a result of this international solidarity. It is interesting to note that while capitalist interests in Britain and colonial India were in conflict, the working class interests largely cooperated. Now, we can discuss about the colonial continuities in the post-colonial period. Colonial continuities can even be viewed in the post-colonial labor relations. The Indian national leadership decided to inherit not just the armed forces and the bureaucracy, but also the entire body of colonial legislation. In the independent India, capitalist class continued to be dependent on the state to discipline the working class. The basic idea behind the post-independence labor policy was that the industrial peace needs to be maintained at any cost for the economic revival and advancement while ensuring the right to peaceful strikes to the workers. One important trend towards the end of the colonial period was the Congress adopting a role as a referee between capital and labor, giving the government extensive rights to intervene. This was one element of a broader set of economic policies involving a large role for the state adopted after independence. It was argued that the post-independent state was more welfarist and interventionist than the colonial state. State's interventionist policy was sanctified by arguing that the Indian workers were not matured enough to knowing or achieving their rights. Thus, the government and trade unions need to protect them and act on behalf of them. So this is part of the paternalistic attitude of the state, which is also visible in the colonial period. And it continued in the post-colonial period. The Constitution of Independent India contains many protective and progressive principles concerning labor welfare. Labor law was included in the concurrent list of the Indian Constitution. Prohibition of forced labor, prohibition of employment of children in factories, right to work, provision for just and humane condition of work, and maternity relief, right to a living wage, etc., were some of the provisions in the Constitution to protect labor rights. But most of these provisions are not legally enforceable. You may be already knowing that all these provisions are in the directive principles of the state policy. So it's not legally enforceable. And there are also some fundamental rights like Article 23 and 24, which are legally enforceable, but state is not having the willpower to implement it. The policy of the Nehruvian government. So you all know that just after the independence, after 1947, the first government which came into power is under the leadership of Nehru. And the initial years of his rule was focused on the industrial peace and create a favorable environment for capital investment. This led to the enactment of a series of labor legislations in the initial years of independence. The Industrial Disputes Act of 1947, the Factories Act of 1948, the Minimum Wages Act of 48, the Employees State Insurance Act of 1948, the Employees Provident Fund Act of 1952, the Plantation Labor Act of 51, the Mines Act of 52, and the Maternity Benefit Act of 61 are the most important among this set of legislation enacted in the liberal period of the independent India. Provision of fair wages and social security were the main objectives of these legislation. However, on the ground, implementation of these acts was questionable. Part of this can be attributed to the colonial mindset and the bureaucracy and the police force had inherited from yesteryears. The decades that followed, especially the years after Indira Gandhi resumed office, the conflict between Indian state and workers accelerated. The democratic rights of the workers were curtailed, and working class struggles were faced with massive state repression, like in the colonial period. So this is a period we can say as the authoritative regime, especially for the working class, and their rights were severely curtailed. The Essential Service Maintenance Act, ESMA, was widely used to prevent the working class from carrying out their lawful strikes. Any serious challenge by the working class was repressed ruthlessly by using the state machinery. During Indira Gandhi's term in 1974, the trade unions in Indian Railway, except INTUC, struck work by demanding 8 hours of work and raise in pay scale. Around 17 lakh workers participated in the 20-day strike. So this is one of the longest strike and also the largest in terms of the number of workers participated in it. Despite the massive working class participation in the strike, the government's policy was to break the strike by using the entire state machinery. Even though the strike was successful, that the entire railway traffic came to a standstill, the strike was withdrawn after 20 days as the government was not ready to negotiate. So according to me, in my opinion, every strike is successful because it is an expression of dissent. So if we are able to dissent, that itself is a success. This was also the period in which India had undergone a national emergency in 1975. After the emergency in her 20-point economic program, Indira Gandhi included the enactment of an act for the abolition of bonded labor. Consequently, the Bonded Labor System Act was passed in 1976. This might be one of the exceptions in the anti-labor legislation enacted during this period. The Janata Party's rule, which assumed office in 1977 after the emergency, didn't make any difference in attitude towards working class demands. Indira Gandhi returned to power in 1980 and continued from where she had left off in the previous term. So during this period, we can't see much change in the attitude of the state, especially the repressive attitude of the state. The latter part of the 1980s witnessed the Indian state leaning towards neoliberal policies. This came to the political forefront in the year 1991, when the state announced its solidarity with the capitalists and relaxed several industrial regulations so as to facilitate a better environment for capitalist accumulation. Naturally, the most affected in this development were the working class. The state began distancing itself from its responsibility to ensure labor welfare and labor control. So the state has stepped back from its responsibility to ensure the labor welfare. Less regulation in terms of industrial policy became the norm and left the disciplining of the labor to market forces. The retrenchment became easier and common in the informal sector. The state withdrawal from the spheres of labor legislation and labor welfare resulted in the informalization tendencies and decreasing the collective bargaining power of the workers. So here you can say that by withdrawing from the labor market, the state has promoted the creation of a sector called informal sector. And it is mostly the unregulated market. The neoliberal state in the 21st century portrayed new labor laws as necessary reforms in helping the state for clearing all hindrances to create a favorable investment environment. Without any precautionary measures, opening up the economy to the national and international capital to avail cheap labor in India is a classic case of neoliberal state acting in favor of investment capital at the cost of labor rights. The state itself promotes the casualization and subcontracting of labor in the name of employment generation. There are legislation like National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005, the Social Security Act 2008, which are initiated by the Indian state to regulate the unorganized or informal sector, but pay very little attention in its effective enforcement. We often forget the problems of Indian informal sector, which constitute around 92% of the workforce in India. This workforce in the Indian informal sector is not provided with any effective social, legal protection in relation to their conditions of employment. Many a time, informal employment is a result of inability of a legislation to be applicable to a specific category of workers. As there is no proof of them as the workers of an employer, it is essential for the state to ensure that proper implementation of acts such as Minimum Wage Act and to establish an efficient and speedy grievance redressal mechanism to justify its credibility as a welfare state. The most worrisome fact is that often this legally defined minimum wage has been the maximum wage in the informal sector. Unlike the formal sector, the wages of workers in the informal sector are not periodically revised with the rising inflation. So now we can see some of the recent trend in the legal intervention of the state. You all know that in 2020, there are some legislation which was implemented by the Indian government with respect to the labor sector. There are three important legislation passed by the current government in 2020, namely Industrial Relations Code Bill 2020, Code on Social Security Bill, Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code Bill. These recent attempts of labor reforms by the current Indian government, which can be understood as a step towards introducing fixed contract jobs across the private sector and allows flexibility in hiring and recruitment without government permission. This flexibility in labor relations is brought in through an increase in the threshold relating to layoffs and retrenchment in industrial establishments having 300 workers from 100 workers or more at present. The free functioning of the trade unions was curtailed, and industrial strikes are more difficult to organize according to the provisions of the law. This is a move aimed at furthering the informalization of labor relations in the formal sector. And we can also see that this is also a move to criminalize the acts of resistance or criminalize the trade union activities. So this is also a tendency in the colonial period. The recent developments as a farmers, such as farmers' protest and various national strikes by the trade unions shows that the culture of working class strikes still exists in the country as vigorous as before, but with changes in the nature of the neoliberal state, these struggles were not effective in terms of achieving its goals. There is a need for trade unions to evolve from the existing tactics of resistance and find new methods to cope up with the changing nature of capitalism. But there are some exceptions like CITU, AITUC, who spreads its activities to unorganized sector and try to resist the neoliberal agendas of the state and capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Suramya. That was really an exhaustive and a comprehensive account of how historically the laws have formed, and especially from the international movement to India, and a detailed account of how laws have evolved within India itself. Uh, so, actually, I have a couple of questions. So now it looks as if that the working hours, the regulation of working hours, especially to 8 hours, has been achieved after a lot of struggles, after a lot of conflict between the working class and the capital, and also with the intervention of the state. But now we do see these days that in corporates or in any large organizations, especially managerial class and even at the clerical level, people are working more than 9 hours. And especially we hear stories of people in financial sector or consulting sector working for like 14 hours, 18 hours a day sometimes. So and they say often it's voluntarily. I mean, the incentives are so aligned that they are working voluntarily. So how do laws look at that? Is it illegal or is it allowed?
So basically, how we can look into this issue is from the perspective of, we can say that state. So state is allowing such kind of tendencies just because they can withdraw back from the capital labor market. So we can see that these kind of tendencies are basically called as the homework. So they work from home itself is making this tendency legal, and people can easily stay away from the what I can say legal aspects of it or legal issues of it, just because this is work from home. So actually the IT people, I think you mean about the IT people basically.
Right.
So the yeah, so these IT people are easily getting exploited just because it's like it's not confined by some kind of laws.
Okay, so just in connection with this, one more question that struck my mind is that almost in all sectors, and all like organized or unorganized sectors both, we see there is an active discouragement of trade union formation. But historically, we have seen the Association of the Working Class or the associations, trade union associations, have fought for these rights or for improving the conditions. But it's also seen often we, especially since you're from Kerala, there's this popular uh, myth, or I don't know if it's a reality. People say that trade unions are too strong, that there is no more efficiency in these organizations. So how do you view
Hmm.
this trade union formation? Is it necessary? Has it been necessary, or do you think
Hmm.
there are some pitfalls for trade union formation?
Yeah, obviously. So the last part of my presentation points out that there are need for these trade unions to find like specific strategies to combat the issues, especially the issues in the informal sector. So basically, when the labor market is getting unregulated, the major issue is that the labor is getting informal. So in order to get into this informal sector and spread their activities to informal sector, they need to find some strategies. So I can point out the activities of SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association, so which is basically active in Ahmedabad. So they actually organize this people, women in the informal sector, like small scale household sector women working in household sector, and they like actively work among them, and they fight for their rights and their issues. So I think these kind of nuanced initiatives should come from the trade unions, unless and until unless and until this what I can say, the state is stepping back from the labor market. So because of that, the trade union should be able to push the state to get back to the sector, especially the informal sector, and implement more laws, and also enact more laws and effectively implement it.
Thanks. If audience have any questions, we are willing to take. You can either type in the chat box or you can ask the speaker directly. Okay, we will wait for that. So, just can you also provide some instances? So, recently we have seen some of these strikes. Like you said, in your opinion, just the fact that there is resistance, that the fact there is dissent. So, whether or not the movement, a trade union movement or a worker strike, have been able to successfully meet its demands or able to force the state to concede to its demands. Irrespective of that, it's a success in itself. So recently, we
Yeah,
have seen a farmers' protest, and around that time, we have also seen a huge workers' strike, like all India. So once in a while,
yeah.
we do see almost annual basis that there are this
Hmm.
national-wide call for strikes. So,
Mhm.
have these recently, do you think the strikes have increased? Like, do you think the conditions of the labor across sectors is worsening, and that is why we are seeing more strikes? So can they be successful in themselves? That's
Mm.
yeah.
Like we can see why it is like arising, or how it is culminating to. So these kind of questions are arising from the studies in like labor history, and you can't say that because of strikes, the increasing number of strikes, the issues are increasing or something. Still we have issues. I'm not telling that we don't have issues or something, but we are not able to channelize these issues to culminate into more strikes or something. And these we can take the example of IT professionals. So they do have organizations, they do have issues, but strikes are not organized from their part, just because the system itself is restricting them from preventing them from not organizing against or IT companies. So these kind of restrictions or kind of limitations are there for these people. And even though strikes are there, it is not involving more sectors or people from different sectors. And it's kind of token strikes. So I can say that these annual strikes are becoming token strikes without taking up the real issues of people, or without focusing on some sectors or some people. So this is an issue, I guess.
There's one question from the audience. What is the state of legislation or moves towards organizing migrant workers?
Yeah, you can say that the recent bill, I mentioned about three bills which is enacted recently in 1920s, in 2020. This is aiming at the migrant workers, and they actually casualizing the migrant workers labor, and they are also trying to push them into more informality, and they are not concerned about the issues of migrant workers. And organizing those migrant workers are really a hectic task, because trade unions can't even trace their origin or where they work, because they are not part of any particular employer. So they change the employers, or they move from one side to another side. You can see that these migrant workers are primarily employed in construction work, and these construction work itself is a contract work or a casual labor. So due to that, it's really difficult to point out the migrant workers or where they belong to. So that itself is creating issues for organizing these workers. I'm not able to hear you, Prandeep.
Oh, sorry. So there's one organization called Ajivika Bureau. I think we can follow it on Twitter, etc. So this organization tries to provide some sort of facilities to migrant workers, such as helping them in getting identity cards, because most of them do not even have a proper identity card to where they're located. And I think so. It's like we are seeing some efforts from civil society organizations, but I don't think there is much from the contractors themselves or state themselves, right?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned. The
Yeah,
SEWA is not a conventional trade union. So it
exactly.
is just an organization in order to organize this unadvantaged women. And you can see more this NGOs who's like part of these organizations, who's organizing this informal workers, not the so-called formal trade unions. But now there is efforts from the part of organizations or trade unions like CITU, AITUC, in order to mobilize these workers and organize them and fight against the fight for the their rights. So you can see these changes, but it's not enough, I guess.
Right. Actually, I would also like to know, we have some time left. One more question I would like to ask is, what is your take on how the farmers' protest has happened? Because often people said it's impossible to organize farmers or peasants who are scattered across the country at a large scale. But now we have seen that nearly 41 trade unions from across different political alliances, from
Yeah.
across, cutting across this thing, they have come together and they have been able to sustain a movement for almost like 5-6 months now. Though the government is not yielding to it, but at least they could buy some relief, like they could get something. So do you think this has some insights or some lessons for other sectors also, where often people thought it is impossible to mobilize? So what are your thoughts on how this happened?
I think this is one of the largest protest or strike we could witness in the history of India itself, and also large number of farmers came together, and in the cold weather, and also the like conditions which is very disadvantaged, they could mobilize in Delhi and they could organize their own ways of struggle, strikes and other measures, rallies and tractor rally and all this kind of like expressions. So this is one of the it is like truly a lesson for other sectors or other workers, and for migrant workers or for the other workers in the informal sector. So it shows that they can mobilize, but like we have some kind of limitations. So farmers, they have like unity among themselves. They have a social structure in order to come to like Delhi, or like in order to mobilize in Delhi. They have some kind of capital in their hand in order to travel to Delhi for many of the farmers. So that itself is a thing which, like because of that, they could mobilize in Delhi and they could fight. But these like migrant workers or disadvantaged women, they don't have the they don't have a say, or they don't have the capital to come together, or they are like disadvantaged kind of labor. So they, it's not possible them to entirely come together or like entirely mobilize in a place and do the kind of protest the farmers were doing. So I think it's not, we can't compare these sectors really, because this, the capital what the farmers having is like not feasible for the workers in other sectors, especially the informal sector workers, women or like migrant workers, or like people like that.
Right. I think they're also not a powerful political lobby like how we have seen farmers are in some
Yeah,
sections. At least rich farmers in
yeah,
across states are
yeah,
the key lobbies.
yeah.
Uh,
That's why I have mentioned the capital
right.
what they have.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, I think there's just a follow-up comment from, I don't know the name of the person. So he's saying thanks that he thinks Migrant Workers Solidarity Network is also making forays into organizing as well, especially during these lockdowns. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that is true. There are some kind of like attempts by the state also. Like in Kerala, you can see that there is this kind of like attempt from the part of the state to organize the migrant workers and provide some kind of initiate some kind of solidarity for them, and also providing basic like necessities for them, like atta or like oil and these kind of things to be provided to migrant workers. So these things itself shows that from the part of the state, at least in some kind, they are getting some benefits from the part of the state, and that itself like giving them some opportunity to raise their voice or identify themselves as like attach themselves to a particular place or particular like what can I say, a particular group. So identify themselves as the group of migrant workers, and that itself makes some kind of solidarity to like fight against this pandemic or the situation in this like adverse situation in this current scenario.
Okay, so I guess that's all. We do not have any more questions. So yeah, thank you very much for joining. It's been a wonderful experience for me, and particularly I think the way you presented the entire facts, it's very difficult for anybody to get everything together in one place, and it's a lot of work and a lot of rigorous research that you presented to us.
I'm
So
really sorry that I couldn't present it very well, because you just gave me one day, so I
yeah, I
had
don't
to
no
like
no.
prepare
It
like
was really
2
good. It's
hours.
really informative and a lot of facts and a lot of insights have gone into it. So I think that's good. But thank you, yeah, thank you for doing it in like 1 day's notice so much. Yeah, yeah. So
Thank you.